Have you ever looked at someone and thought you knew everything about them? Did you believe their life was a routine, without surprises, without drama? I did. And I was wrong in the most painful way possible. I thought Professor Morales was just that. A professor, boring, predictable, with a life as flat as the graphs he drew on the blackboard. But what I didn't know was that behind his thick glasses and monotonous voice hid a story so deep, so full of pain and sacrifice that it would change the way I see the world forever. My name is Mateo. When I met Professor Morales, I was a mess, a young man full of rage and aimless, believing I knew more than anyone, that the world owed me something. My parents, already tired of my outbursts, had forced me to attend tutoring classes. One of those classes was, of course, advanced mathematics, with Professor Morales himself. He always wore the same grey pants, the same plaid shirt, and always carried a thermos of coffee that seemed to be his only company. His classes were a sleeping pill. I remember sitting at the back of the classroom drawing doodles in my notebook, ignoring every word that came out of his mouth. For me, he was the personification of boredom. One day, while I was wandering in my mind, I heard something different in his voice. It wasn't his usual tone, it was tired. I looked up. He was standing by the window watching the rain fall. His back was slightly hunched. For a moment his gaze was lost on the horizon, as if he was seeing something that no one else could see. And then he uttered a phrase that made me raise an eyebrow. "Life," he said, "is like a very complex equation. Each decision is a variable, and the result is never what you expect." My classmates laughed quietly. I just felt a shiver. I don't know why, but that phrase stuck with me. That day, something about him seemed different. The days passed and my attitude didn't improve. I was still the problem kid. One day, after one of his classes, I stayed in the cafeteria. I was checking my phone when a shadow fell over my table. It was Professor Morales. He looked at me with that "I know what you're doing" look. I expected a sermon, a reprimand, something I was already used to ignoring. But instead he sat down in front of me without saying a word, sipping his coffee. The silence was deafening. Finally, after what seemed like hours, he just said, "You know, Mateo, once I also thought I had all the answers." What was behind that phrase? What had Professor Morales experienced to say something like that? That was the first time Professor Morales spoke to me about something other than numbers or formulas. He told me, without going into much detail, that when he was young he had been very impulsive, just like me, that he had made mistakes, that he had made decisions that led him down unexpected paths. He spoke of a lost love, of broken dreams. His words, so simple, had a weight that I had never perceived in him before. From that day on, something changed between us. I, the rebellious kid, started listening to him. He, the boring professor, started to open up, little by little. One afternoon, while we were in the chemistry lab, where he also taught, he asked me to help him arrange some materials. He told me about his past, about when he dreamed of being a great scientist. He told me that his greatest dream was to find a cure for a rare disease that affected his family. His voice, normally monotonous, filled with a passion I had never seen. He spoke of sleepless nights, of failed experiments, of the frustration of not finding the solution. And then he looked me straight in the eye. "Sometimes," he said, "no matter how much you fight, there are things you can't change. And others, no matter how much you want to, you can't let go." That phrase pierced me deeply. I felt a connection with him, an understanding that I had not felt with anyone else. Months passed. My grades improved. My attitude changed. I felt calmer, more focused. Professor Morales, without knowing it, had become a kind of guide for me. One day, he called me to his office after class. He was sitting at his desk with some papers in his hand. His face, normally impassive, was pale. He offered me a seat. There was a heavy air in the room. "Matteo," he began, his voice almost a whisper, "there's something you should know. Something that will help you understand why I am the way I am." What great secret did Professor Morales hold that had transformed him from a dreamy young man into that seemingly emotionless man? Professor Morales told me his story, a story that left me breathless. He told me about his youth, full of promise, of a deep love with a woman named Tanya. Both were brilliant scientists, working together in the search for that cure. They were about to achieve it. The breakthrough was within their reach. But one day, Tanya got sick. Not from the disease they were investigating, but from another, one that had no known cure. Professor Morales faced the most difficult decision of his life. He could continue with his research, the dream of his entire life, and perhaps save others, or he could dedicate himself completely to Tanya, knowing that her fate was already sealed. He chose to stay with Tanya. He left the lab, abandoned his dreams of scientific glory. He dedicated himself body and soul to taking care of her, to giving her the greatest comfort in her last days. He described the agony of watching her fade away, the impotence, the pain of knowing there was nothing he could do. His eyes, at that moment, filled with tears, something I would never, in 1,000 years, have expected to see in him. "Life," he said to me with a broken voice, "takes away what you love most, but it also gives you the opportunity to love with all your being, even if it hurts." He didn't seek the cure to save the world, but to save one person in particular. And when he couldn't, he gave up everything. After Tanya's death, Professor Morales sank into a deep sadness. He had lost his love, his purpose, his reason for being. He turned away from science, from the world he knew. He began to look for a new path, something that would give meaning to his existence. It was then that he decided to dedicate himself to teaching. He wanted to share the knowledge he had acquired, not to achieve fame, but to ignite the spark in other young people. He wanted them not to make the same mistakes. He did, not to miss the opportunity to live life to the fullest. But Tanya's pain never left him. Every day, every number on the blackboard, every equation was a reminder of what he had lost. That's why his voice was monotonous, his gaze distant. It wasn't boredom. It was the weight of immense sorrow, the echo of a love that still beat in his heart. One day, while he was explaining a physics problem to me, he stopped in the middle of the sentence, his gaze fixed on a distant point. There was a very faint scar on his wrist, which I had never noticed before. It was almost imperceptible, like a faded line on his skin. He realized I was seeing it. His face turned even paler, and quickly he lowered his shirt sleeve. What did that scar mean? Was there another layer of pain, another hidden story beyond? Tanya's? I didn't dare ask about the scar at that moment, but that night I couldn't sleep. The image of his pale face and the quick movement of his sleeve repeated in my mind. The next day I arrived early at school, intending to talk to him. I found him in his office, drinking his coffee as always. I gathered my courage. "Professor," I said, "yesterday I saw a scar on your wrist. Is everything okay?" His face contracted. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if he were reliving something very painful. And then, with a voice I almost didn't recognize, he whispered, "That scar is the mark of my darkest moment, of when I was about to give up completely." He told me that after Tanya's death, despair had consumed him. He had reached a point where he could find no meaning in anything. The burden of life, the loneliness, the remorse for not having been able to do more for Tanya had brought him to the limit. He recounted with brutal honesty how one night in the darkness of his apartment he had considered ending it all. The scar was a reminder of that night, of the battle he had fought with himself, of the decision he had made to move forward, to find a new purpose. The revelation of the scar left me in shock. I couldn't believe that this man, so seemingly boring and emotionless, had carried so much pain. His story impacted me in a way that nothing else had, but the most surprising thing was yet to come. Professor Morales took me one day to the school lab after class. Not to the classroom where we had classes, but to a small hidden room in the back full of old equipment and strange devices. It was as if time had stopped there. He showed me an old microscope, some dusty test tubes, and a notebook with illegible notes. "This," he said, his voice regaining a bit of the passion he had described to me, "was the lab where Tanya and I worked, where we dreamed of changing the world." He told me about the excitement of the research, the joy of each small advance, and then, with a mysterious look, he said to me, "There's something you don't know, Matteo, something I've kept for a long time, something that has to do with what Tanya and I were about to discover." What had they been about to discover? Was it possible that Professor Morales had continued the research in secret? Professor Morales led me to an old, rusty drawer. Carefully, he opened it. Inside, there was a single flask, small and transparent, with a bright liquid inside. "This, Matteo," he said, his eyes shining with a mixture of sadness and pride, "is what we were about to finish. The cure for the disease that affected my family, to which Tanya dedicated her last breaths." He explained that before Tanya worsened, they had managed to synthesize a key part of the cure. He had kept it not only as a memory, but as a promise, a last connection with his lost love. He explained that over time, and despite his pain, he had continued, secretly and very slowly, the research. Not for fame, not for recognition, but to honor Tanya and to fulfill the promise they had made one day. His voice became stronger, his gaze more determined. "And now," he said to me, "after years of working in the dark, of polishing every detail, of overcoming every obstacle, I have finished." My eyes widened. I couldn't believe it. This man, whom I had seen as a boring math teacher, had been working on a medical secret that could change lives. The revelation left me stunned. "And why doesn't anyone know?" I asked him. He sighed, a deep exhalation. "Because," he told me, "the real lesson is not in public success, Matteo. It's in the journey, in the decisions you make, in what you sacrifice, and in how you get up after each fall. The real lesson is that you cannot change the past, but you can influence the future, that even the deepest pain can be transformed into a force for good, that hope, however small, never dies completely." He told me that he had decided not to patent his discovery, not to seek fortune or fame. Instead, he had shared it with a group of researchers from a non-profit organization who would continue with the clinical trials so that the cure would reach those who needed it at no cost. The reason for his apparent boredom, for his simple life, was to dedicate his resources and time to this secret project. He had found a new purpose, not in the science that had abandoned him, but in compassion and hope. That afternoon, Professor Morales gave me the most valuable lesson of my life. He taught me that appearances are deceiving, that behind the simplest facade there can be a story of unimaginable greatness. He taught me that true value is not in what you achieve, but in how you live, in how you face your losses, and in how you use your pain to help others. He who had seemed so boring to me had given me the most exciting lesson of all, the lesson of life itself, with all its complexities, its sorrows, its joys, and its unwavering hope. From that day on, my life changed completely. I stopped being the problem kid. I focused on my studies, but not only to get good grades, but to learn, to understand the world. I began to look at people differently, to look for the story behind each face, not to judge by what I saw on the surface. Professor Morales retired a couple of years later. I visited him often. He always had a cup of coffee for me and a new story, a new reflection. And I, who used to see him as a boring professor, now see him as the man who saved me, who taught me the true meaning of life. One day I received a call. It was from the hospital. Professor Morales had been admitted urgently. I ran to the hospital with my heart in my hand. When I arrived, I found him in a bed, pale, weaker than I had ever seen him. He looked at me, and with a weak smile, he said to me, "Mateo, there is something else I haven't told you, something that changed my life in a way I never expected." He paused, coughing, and continued, "You remember the disease that Tanya and I were investigating, the one that affected my family, the one that my cure was designed to combat." My mind began to race, but I couldn't predict what he was going to say. He looked me in the eyes, and his voice, barely a thread, uttered the words that froze my blood. I have that disease, Mateo. The cure that Professor Morales had spent his entire life searching for and perfecting, the cure that he had given to the non-profit organization so that it would help others without seeking anything in return, was the cure for his own disease. He had been fighting it silently for years, the same disease that had taken his family and that Tanya and he had been about to eradicate. His sacrifice was not only for love of Tanya, nor for the pain of a broken past. It was a living promise, a silent battle against his own destiny, to ensure that no one else would have to suffer what he and his beloved had endured. The boring professor had not only given me the most valuable lesson of my life, but had lived a life of sacrifice, of unconditional love, and of a hope that defied death itself. And I, who thought I was so clever, was just beginning to understand the true magnitude of his greatness. His story is that of a silent hero, whose greatest lesson was not in the classroom, but in the way he lived, loved, and finally gave his legacy to the world. If you like this story, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more moving stories that will touch your heart and make you reflect, like the poorest salesman in the store who saved his boss from going bankrupt, and what he asked for in return will make you cry.